The stars had never looked so beautiful as they did from the observation deck of New Haven Colony, and Kim Tae-sun stood there every night watching them like old friends who had guided his people to this distant world. 15 years ago, he had arrived on this moon with nothing but hope and 3,000 desperate souls looking for a new beginning. And now 12,000 humans called this place home. And he had built something worth protecting. The colony sat in a valley surrounded by mountains, rich with minerals that Earth desperately needed, and they had carved their lives into the rock itself, building underground networks that stretched for miles. Beneath the surface and above ground, their city gleamed with lights that pushed back the eternal darkness of Space Tae-sun. Was not a young man anymore, and his hair had turned gray and his face carried the weight of every decision he had ever made, but his eyes still burned with the fire that had made him a legend during the Mars insurgency decades ago, and he had traded his uniform for civilian clothes, but he had never truly stopped being a soldier. The alarm came at 3 in the morning, when most of the colony slept peacefully in their beds. Park Yuna was the first to see it, and she sat alone in the communication center, monitoring the endless stream of data that connected them to Earth and other human colonies across the stars, and her fingers froze over her keyboard. When the signal appeared on her screen, she was young and had been born on the colony itself, and had never known Earth except through stories and pictures. But she knew enough to recognize that the transmission she had just intercepted would change everything. The message was simple and cold, and it came from a fleet of ships that had just entered their system, and the aliens called themselves the Dominion, and they claimed sovereignty over this sector of space, and they demanded complete surrender within 72 hours. Yuna ran through the empty corridors, her heart pounding in her chest, until she reached the governor's quarters, and she banged on the door until Tae-sun appeared with tired eyes that became sharp the moment he saw her face. He read the message 3 times before speaking, and each time his jaw tightened a little more. And finally he looked up at Yuna and said, "We need to call the council within." The hour they had gathered in the war room that had not been used since the early days of the colony, and Lee Dong-wook arrived first because he never slept much anyway, and his body was covered in scars from battles fought on worlds most people had never heard of, and he had come to New Haven to find peace, but peace it seemed had not found him. Choi Hana came next, and she was the genius who had designed most of the colony infrastructure, and her mind worked in ways that made others dizzy. And she could look at a problem and see solutions that nobody else could imagine, and she had built New Haven with her bare hands and brilliant brain. Kang Jisoo entered quietly, and she was the medical director who had saved more lives than anyone could count. And during the early years when disease had swept through the colony, she had worked until she collapsed, and then got up and worked some more, and her gentle hands had pulled people back from the edge of death more times than she could remember. Finally, Beek Sunho arrived, and he was the youngest of them all, and he commanded the colonial militia, which was really just a group of miners and farmers who trained on weekends, and he had never seen real combat, but there was something in his eyes that made people follow him. Tae-sun played the transmission for them, and the room fell silent as the alien voice filled the air with its demands and threats, and when it ended, nobody spoke for a long moment. Dong-wook was the first to break the silence, and he leaned forward with his scarred hands flat on the table and asked how many ships, and Yuna answered that her scans showed at least 40 warships and transport vessels carrying what could be tens of thousands of soldiers. The odds were impossible, and everyone in the room knew it, and they had no warships and no heavy weapons and no way to call for help because Earth was months away, even at the fastest speeds. Hana asked if they could evacuate and take the population to the emergency shelters in the deep mines and wait for rescue, but Tae-sun shook his head because rescue would never come in time, and the Dominion would strip the colony bare and leave nothing. Bain Jisoo spoke softly and asked what the Dominion wanted, and Yuna explained that they wanted the minerals and the infrastructure, and they wanted human workers to serve them, and colonies that surrendered were absorbed into their empire as slave labor. Sunho slammed his fist on the table and declared that he would rather die than live as a slave, and the fire in his young eyes reminded Tae-sun of himself many years ago. They talked for hours and debated every option, and considered surrender, and considered flight, and considered hiding, and they always came back to the same conclusion. Dongwook said it plainly and without emotion, and he told them that the Dominion had conquered dozens of worlds, and every single one had surrendered without a fight, and they expected the same from New Haven, and that expectation was their weakness. Tae-sun understood what his old friend was saying, and he felt something stir in his chest that he had not felt in years, and it was the cold calm that came before battle and the clarity that made impossible decisions. Feel simply asked his council if they were willing to fight, knowing they would probably die, and one by one they answered. Hana said she would rather see New Haven burned than handed over to aliens. Jisoo said she would fight to protect the children who had been born here and knew no other home. Sunho said he spoke for the militia, and they would stand until the last one fell. Dongwook simply nodded because words were never his way. Yuna was the last to speak, and her voice trembled but did not break, and she said that she had intercepted communications from other worlds the Dominion had conquered, and the people there lived in misery and chains, and she would not let that happen. Harada-san looked at each of them and felt pride swelling in his heart, and he knew that the odds were against them, and he knew that many would die, and he knew that victory was almost impossible, but he also knew that humans had faced impossible odds before, and sometimes they had won. He made the announcement at dawn, and the entire colony gathered in the central plaza to hear their governor speak, and he told them the truth without softening it, and he explained what was coming and what it would mean. He gave them a choice and said that anyone who wanted to surrender could leave, and the Dominion would probably spare their lives, and no one would think less of them. Not a single person moved. The vote was unanimous, and New Haven would fight, and they would make the Dominion pay for every step they took toward the colony, and they would show the galaxy what happened when you threatened humanity. Sun looked out at the faces of his people and saw fear, but also determination, and he saw parents holding children and workers standing beside scientists, and he saw 12,000 souls who refused to kneel. He raised his voice and made them a promise, and he said that they might not survive, but they would make sure the Dominion never forgot the name New Haven, and they would write their defiance in blood and fire, and the stars themselves would remember. The crowd roared, and the sound echoed off the mountains, and somewhere out in the darkness, the Dominion fleet moved closer, having no idea what was waiting for them. 72 hours and the clock was ticking, and New Haven had work to do. The colony transformed overnight, and sleep became a distant memory as every man and woman, and even the older children, threw themselves into the work of survival. Choi Hana stood in the main engineering bay, surrounded by machines that had been built to dig ore from the ground, and she saw them differently now, and in her mind they were no longer tools of industry, but weapons of war. She called her engineers together and laid out her vision, and they looked at her like she was crazy at first, but then they started to understand, and within hours the work began. The massive excavators that carved tunnels through solid rock were mounted on platforms and turned toward the valley where the Dominion would have to land, and their cutting beams could slice through metal as easily as stone, and Hana calculated that each one could destroy a landing craft before the aliens even touched the ground. The ore processors that crushed rock into powder were modified to launch debris at incredible speeds, and they became artillery that could shred infantry formations from a mile away, and the engineers worked with bleeding hands and burning eyes to make it happen. Underground, the tunnel network became a fortress, and the colonists had spent 15 years digging into the moon, and they knew every passage and every chamber and every hidden corner, and now they turned that knowledge into a weapon. Big Sunho walked through the tunnels with his militia captains, and they marked positions for ambushes and identified choke points where a handful of defenders could hold back an army. And they placed explosives at key intersections that could seal passages or collapse them on top of invaders. Young Captain had never commanded anything larger than training exercises, but something had changed in him since the announcement, and he moved with purpose and spoke with authority, and his people followed. Without question, Li Dongwook trained them in the art of killing, and he gathered the militia in groups and taught them things he had learned in the bloody corridors of Mars and the frozen battlefields of Europa, and he showed them how to fight dirty. Because fair fights were for people who could afford to lose, he taught them to strike from the shadows and disappear before the enemy could react, and he taught them to use the terrain and make every rock and every corner a death trap, and he taught them that courage meant nothing without cunning. The farmers learned to shoot, and the miners learned to build traps, and the teachers learned to tend wounds, and everyone found a role in the defense of their home. Kang Jisoo worked in the medical bay, preparing for the horror that was coming, and she had seen death before, but never on the scale she now anticipated, and she forced herself to stay calm as she organized supplies and trained volunteers. 50 colonists stepped forward to serve as field medics, and most of them had no medical training, but they learned fast because they had no choice. And Jisoo taught them how to stop bleeding, and how to set bones, and how to ease pain when there was nothing else to be done. She converted storage rooms into overflow wards, and she stockpiled bandages and medicines. And she prepared herself mentally for the moment when she would have to choose who to save and who to let go. In the communication center park, Yuna hunted for every scrap of information she could find, and she intercepted Dominion transmissions and decoded their signals and built a picture of the enemy that would give her people an edge. The aliens were confident, and their communications were sloppy because they had never faced resistance, and they discussed their plans openly, assuming no one was listening, and Yuna listened to everything. She learned that the Dominion commander was called Overlord Kreth, and he had conquered 11 worlds and never lost a single battle, and he considered this mission a simple cleanup operation that would be finished in a day. She learned that the Dominion soldiers were well equipped but poorly trained for ground combat, because they had never needed to fight, and their victories came from overwhelming force and the surrender of terrified populations. She learned that they planned to land in the main valley at dawn on the third day and march directly to the colony because they expected the gates to be open and the humans to be. Neil and Yuna brought this information to Taesun, and he smiled for the first time since the warning had come, and he said that arrogance was a gift they would accept gratefully. The governor spent his hours walking through the colony, talking to his people, and strengthening their resolve, and he visited the engineering bays and the training grounds and the medical stations, and everywhere he went, he left behind a little more courage. He found a young mother holding her infant daughter and crying silently, and he sat beside her and told her about his own children who had died in the Mars insurgency, and he told her that he had wanted to give up then, but he had kept fighting because giving up meant their deaths had no meaning. He found an old man sharpening a knife with shaking hands, and the man admitted he was terrified, and Taesun told him that fear was natural, and that bravery was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite. I found teenagers painting slogans on the walls, and they had written phrases like humanity endures, and we do not kneel, and he thanked them because morale was a weapon too. The hours ticked by, and the work continued without pause, and the colony that had been built for peace became a machine of war. Hannah finished the artillery emplacements and tested them on distant rocks that exploded into dust, and she laughed with exhaustion and triumph as her creations performed exactly as she had designed. Sunho completed the tunnel defenses and walked the routes his teams would use to strike at the enemy, and he memorized every turn and every shadow until he could navigate in complete darkness. Dongwook finished training the last group of fighters, and he looked at them and saw farmers and miners and shopkeepers, and he also saw soldiers who would make the Dominion bleed Jisoo, stocked the last of the medical supplies, and said a quiet prayer to whatever gods might be listening, and she hoped she would not need to use everything she had prepared. Una tracked the Dominion fleet as the Dominion fleet as but made. To Dominion them the Minman. To use everything she had prepared. Una tracked the Dominion fleet as Gursu. It moved closer, and she counted down the hours and reported every change in position, and she knew that the next sunrise would bring fire. On the final night before the battle, Taesun gathered his council one last time, and they stood on the observation deck where he had watched the stars so many times before, and they looked out at the darkness together. No one spoke because there was nothing left to say, and they had done everything they could, and now they could only wait. The dawn came slowly, and the sky turned from black to gray to the pale blue that passed for morning on this distant moon, and in the valley below the first Dominion ships broke through the clouds. Taesun watched them descend, and he felt the cold calm settle over him, and he whispered words that only he could hear, and he said, "Come and get us." The battle for New Haven was about to begin. The Dominion ships descended through the morning sky like dark birds of prey, and their hulls gleamed with alien metal, and their engines screamed with power that shook the mountains themselves. Overlord Kreth stood on the bridge of his command vessel and watched the colony below with contempt, and he had done this 11 times before, and every time the outcome was the same, and the weak species of the galaxy always surrendered when they saw the might of the Dominion. He broadcast one final message, demanding immediate surrender, and his voice boomed across the valley and echoed off the cliffs, and he promised mercy to those who knelt and death to those who resisted. The response came in a single word from Governor Kim Taesun, and that word was come. Kreth laughed because he had never heard such defiance, and he assumed it was the desperate bravado of a doomed people, and he ordered his troops to land and crush these foolish humans. The transport ships touched down in the valley floor, and their doors opened, and thousands of Dominion soldiers poured out onto the alien soil, and they formed ranks with practiced precision and began their march toward the colony. They moved with casual confidence, and their weapons hung loose at their sides, and their formation was neat but not defensive, and they expected to reach the colony gates and find them open, and the humans waiting on their knees. The first artillery blast caught them completely by surprise. Choi Hana had aimed the converted excavators perfectly, and the cutting beams sliced through the front ranks like invisible blades, and dozens of soldiers fell in an instant, and the survivors scattered in confusion before they could regroup. The ore launchers opened fire, and waves of razor-sharp debris tore through their lines, and the neat formation became a chaos of screaming wounded and panicking troops. Lee Dong-wook watched from his command position high on the cliffs, and he spoke calmly into his radio, directing fire from one target to another, and he felt nothing but cold satisfaction as the enemy died. The Dominion officers tried to rally their troops, and they pushed forward through the storm of fire, and they used their numbers to absorb the losses and keep advancing, and slowly they began to close the distance. But Hana had prepared for this too. Ground beneath the advancing army had been mined with explosives hidden in the rock, and as the soldiers crossed the marked zones, the charges detonated, and the earth itself swallowed them. Whole tunnels collapsed beneath their feet, and soldiers fell into pits filled with sharpened metal stakes and poisonous gas flooded from broken containers, and the valley became a nightmare of death and chaos. The Dominion advance stalled, and the survivors huddled behind rocks and in craters, and they returned fire at the cliffs, but they could not see their attackers, and their shots went wild. Overlord Kreth watched from orbit, and his contempt turned to confusion, and then to rage, and he ordered more troops to the surface, and he demanded that his officers take control of the situation. The second wave landed behind the first, and they pushed forward with more caution. But caution was not enough, and the colonists had prepared for caution. Beek Sunho led his strike teams through the tunnels beneath the valley, and they emerged behind The enemy lines like ghosts, and they hit the supply convoys and the communication relays and the medical stations, and then they vanished before the Dominion could respond. The young captain moved through the darkness with his people close behind, and they struck again, and each time they left dead enemies and burning equipment, and when the Dominion sent troops to hunt them, they found only empty tunnel. Sunho lost people too, and he watched friends fall, and he carried their bodies when he could and left them when he could not, and each death hardened something inside him that would never be soft again on. The surface Dongwook continued to direct the defense, and he shifted artillery to cover weak points, and he called in strikes from hidden positions, and he made the enemy pay for every meter they advanced. By nightfall, the Dominion had lost 2,000 soldiers, and they had moved exactly 300 meters toward the colony, and their officers were dead or demoralized, and their troops were exhausted, and Terafeedkreth raged on his command ship, and he could not understand how this was happening. And he had conquered 11 worlds and never faced anything like this, and these humans were supposed to be weak and primitive. He made a decision born of fury rather than strategy, and he ordered his warships to bombard the colony from orbit, and he would burn these insects out of their holes. The first orbital strikes hit the outer buildings, and the explosions lit up the night sky, and structures that had taken years to build crumbled in seconds, and fire spread through the streets. But the colonists were not there. Sai-san had ordered the evacuation hours before, and the population had retreated into the deep tunnels that Hana had reinforced, and they huddled in the darkness, listening to the thunder above, and they held each other and waited. The bombardment continued through the night, and Kreth watched with satisfaction as the colony burned, and he assumed that the humans were dying in the flames, and he prepared to send his troops in to finish the survivors. But when dawn came and his soldiers advanced, they found only empty ruins and cold ashes, and the humans had vanished like smoke. Hannah sat in the main tunnel command center and monitored the damage, and she reported to Tae-sun that they had lost 30% of the surface structures, but the critical systems were intact, and the tunnels. And Heljisu treated the wounded in the underground medical bay, and she had lost count of how many she had saved and how many she had lost, and her hands never stopped moving, and her face never showed the horror she felt inside. Yuna continued to intercept Dominion communications, and she heard the confusion and fear in the enemy transmissions, and she heard officers arguing about what to do next, and she heard soldiers whispering that maybe they should retreat. She brought this information to Tae-san, and he nodded slowly and said that the first day had been a victory, but the war was just beginning. The Dominion still had thousands of soldiers and dozens of ships, and they would adapt and overcome their initial shock, and they would come again with more force and more fury. But the colonists had proven something that night, and they had shown that humans could fight, and that the Dominion could bleed, and that this world would not surrender. Tae-sun looked at his exhausted council, and he saw the same determination in their eyes that he felt in his heart, and he told them to rest, because tomorrow would be harder. Outside, the Dominion licked its wounds and planned its next assault, and somewhere in the darkness, Overlord Kreth stared at the burned colony and felt something he had never felt before. He felt doubt. The siege lasted 11 days, and each day brought new horrors and new losses and new moments of desperate courage that pushed the limits of what humans could endure. The Dominion adapted after their first humiliating defeat, and they stopped marching in neat formations and started moving in small groups that were harder to target, and they brought up heavy weapons that could punch through rock, and they learned to check for traps before advancing. But the colonists adapted too, and they moved their artillery positions every few hours, and they created new traps to replace the ones that had been discovered, and they found ways to fight that the Dominion had never seen before. Lee Dong-wook commanded the surface defense with the calm of a man who had already accepted death, and he slept in 2-hour intervals and ate only when someone forced food into his hands, and his voice on the radio became the heartbeat of the resistance. lost positions and retook them, and lost them again. And each time, he calculated the cost and weighed it against the damage done to the enemy, and he made choices that haunted him, but never hesitated. On the third day, the Dominion breached the outer tunnels, and soldiers poured into the underground network, and for hours, the fighting was hand-to-hand in the narrow passages, and the walls ran with blood of both species. Beak Sanho led the counterattack and his militia. Fighters knew the tunnels like they knew their own homes, and they used that knowledge to surround the invaders and cut them off from reinforcements, and they killed them in the darkness. The young captain took a wound that day when an enemy blade sliced across his ribs, and Kang Jisoo stitched him back together and told him to rest, but he was back in the tunnels within hours because his people needed him. Jisoo worked 18-hour shifts, and her gentle hands became instruments of desperate efficiency, and she made choices that would have been unthinkable before the siege, and she saved who she could and eased the passing of those she could not. She ran out of painkillers on day 5, and after that the medical bay was filled with screaming, and she learned to work through the sound, and she learned to keep her face calm when inside she was breaking. Her volunteers collapsed from exhaustion, and she carried on alone. And she operated by the light of emergency lamps when the power failed, and she invented new treatments from whatever supplies she could. In day 6, the Dominion launched a massive assault on 3 fronts simultaneously, and they threw 5,000 soldiers at the colony defenses, and they expected to overwhelm the humans through sheer numbers. Choi Hana had anticipated this, and she had held back her most powerful weapons for exactly this moment. And when the enemy massed for their attack, she unleashed everything she had. The mine charges buried beneath the main approach detonated in a chain reaction, and the ground itself rose up and swallowed the Dominion advance, and thousands died in seconds, and the survivors fled in terror. But the victory came at a cost, and the explosions destabilized a section of the tunnel network, and 200 colonists were trapped when the passages collapsed, and rescue teams worked for 30 hours to dig them out, and only half were still alive. Taesun felt each death like a knife in his chest, and he walked through the tunnels, speaking to his people, and he held the hands of the dying, and he promised the living that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. On day 7, Park Yuna achieved a breakthrough that changed everything, and she finally cracked the encryption on the Dominion command frequency, and suddenly she could hear every order that Overlord Kreth gave to his officers. She fed the information directly to Dongwook, and every trap became more deadly, and every ambush more precise, and the Dominion began to believe that the humans could read their minds. Kreth grew paranoid, and he changed his codes daily, but Yuna broke them each time, and she stayed awake for 3 days straight, hunting through the data for any advantage, and when she finally collapsed, Taesun carried her to a cot and ordered her to sleep. On day 9, the colonists made a choice that would determine the fate of the siege, and Taesun gathered his council and proposed a counterattack that was either brilliant or suicidal. The Dominion command post was located 2 miles from the colony, and it was heavily defended, but it was also the brain of the enemy operation, and without it, their coordination would collapse. Sunho volunteered to lead the assault, and he asked for 300 volunteers, and 500 stepped forward, and he had to choose who would come and who would stay behind. They moved through the tunnels at night and emerged in a gully that Hana had identified from the surface scans, and they crossed the open ground in darkness, using every shadow and every rock for cover. The attack came at midnight, and the colonists struck with desperate fury, and they overran the outer defenses before the Dominion could react, and they pushed toward the command bunker where Overlord Kreth himself was sleeping. Sunho led the charge, and he felt bullets pass through the air around him, and he saw his friends fall, but he did not stop, and he reached the bunker door, and the explosives his team had planted blew it open. The fighting inside was brutal and close, and Sunho killed 3 Dominion officers with his bare hands when his weapon jammed, and he took another wound in his shoulder, but he kept moving. The did not capture Kreth because the Overlord escaped through a hidden passage, but they killed his second in command and destroyed the communication arrays and burned the tactical computers. And when they retreated, they left the command post in flames. Only 143 of the 300 made it back to the tunnels, and Sung-Ho carried 2 wounded soldiers on his shoulders, and his blood mixed with theirs, and he did not stop until they were safe underground. The Dominion army was leaderless now, and the officers argued among themselves, and the soldiers had lost faith in their commanders. And the humans sensed the change in the wind. In Day 11, Tae-san broadcast a message on the frequency that Yuna had captured, and his voice reached every Dominion soldier on the planet, and he spoke simply and without anger. He told them that they had come for his home and found their grave, and he told them that 8,000 of their comrades were dead, and the humans were still fighting, and he told them to leave now or join their fallen. For 6 hours, there was silence, and then the Dominion ships began to lift off, and the surviving soldiers retreated to the transports, and the fleet turned and accelerated away from the planet. Tuna tracked them until they left the system, and then she slumped in her chair and wept because it was finally over. Tae-san stood on the observation deck and watched the enemy flee, and he felt no joy because the cost had been too high and too many of his people would never see another sunrise. But they had survived, and they had won, and humanity had proven something to the galaxy that would never be forgotten. The silence after the battle was harder to bear than the fighting itself, and the colonists emerged from their tunnels into a world transformed by war, and they looked at the ruins of their home, and many of them wept. The valley that had once been green with imported earth plants was now a wasteland of craters and burned metal, and the bodies of the fallen lay everywhere, and the air smelled of smoke and death. Kim Tae-san walked through the destruction with heavy steps, and he counted the cost of their victory, and the numbers crushed his heart, even as they filled him with savage pride. 847 colonists had died, and they were mothers and fathers and children and friends, and each one had a name and a story, and a future that would never come to pass. But in that same valley lay over 8,000 Dominion soldiers, and their bodies stretched from the landing zone to the colony walls, and they had come to take everything, and instead they had lost everything. The work of recovery began immediately because grief was a luxury they could not yet afford, and the survivors organized into teams, and they collected the human dead with reverence and carried them to the memorial ground that Tae-san had chosen. Each body was wrapped in white cloth, and each name was recorded, and each family was notified, and the ceremonies were brief because there were so many, but every single soul was honored. The Dominion dead were treated differently, and the colonists dug a massive pit in the center of the valley where the heaviest fighting had occurred, and they buried the alien bodies without ceremony and covered them with stone and earth. Some argued that they should leave the corpses to rot as a warning to others, but Tae-san refused because he said they were not savages, and even enemies deserved to rest in peace. Joy Hana threw herself into rebuilding, and she could not bear to sit still with her thoughts, and so she worked from dawn until she collapsed. And then she got up and worked some more. The surface structures were damaged but not destroyed, and the critical systems underground had survived intact, and within weeks, the colony was functional again, and within months, it would be stronger than before. She designed new defenses that would make New Haven a fortress, and she created weapons that would destroy any fleet foolish enough to return, and she swore that her people would never be caught unprepared again. Lee Dong-wook did not celebrate the victory, and he spent his days walking the battlefield and remembering the faces of those who had fallen under his command, and he carried their deaths like stones in his chest, had done what was necessary, and he had made the choices that won the war, but those choices had cost lives, and he would never forgive himself, even though everyone else called him a hero. One night, Tae-san found him sitting alone on the cliffs, and they talked for hours about guilt and duty and the price of leadership, and in the end Dongwook did not feel better, but he felt less alone. Kang Jisoo treated the wounded long after the fighting stopped, and the medical bay was full of soldiers who had lost limbs and eyes and parts of themselves that would never grow back, and she gave them what comfort she could. She also treated the invisible wounds and the nightmares that plagued the survivors and the fear that made strong men flinch at sudden sounds, and she learned that some injuries never fully healed. She lost patients in the weeks after the battle, and their bodies gave out from infections and complications and exhaustion, and each death reminded her of her own failures. Even though she had saved hundreds more, Baek Sunho became a different person, and the young captain who had led the militia and war had burned away his innocence and left behind something harder and sharper, and he was not sure he liked who he had become. He visited the families of those who had died under his command, and he told them how their loved ones had fought and how bravely they had fallen, and he accepted their tears and their anger and their gratitude. The young mother whose husband had died in the tunnel collapse screamed at him and beat her fists against his chest, and he stood there and took it because he knew she needed someone to blame. Park Yuna compiled a record of everything that had happened, and she gathered testimony from survivors and collected data from her intercepts as she created a document that would tell the story of New Haven to the galaxy. She transmitted the record to Earth and to every human colony and to every alien civilization that might be listening, and she wanted the universe to know what humans could do when pushed to the edge. The response came slowly at first, and then it became a flood, and messages arrived from across known space, and they came from humans who cheered and aliens who were amazed, and even from species that the Dominion had conquered. The story of New Haven spread like fire, and it reached worlds where resistance movements had been crushed, and it gave them hope, and it reached the halls of the Dominion Empire, and it made them afraid. 3 months after the siege, a diplomatic vessel from the Dominion entered the system, and it came under a flag of truce, and it requested permission to land and speak with the colonial leadership. The sun met them in the valley where their soldiers had died, and he stood before the alien diplomats with his council beside him, and he listened to their offer of peace and compensation and formal recognition of human territory, considered their words carefully, and then he gave his response, and he said that peace was acceptable, but compensation was unnecessary because the colonists had already taken everything they needed from the Dominion dead. The diplomats flinched, and they looked at the fresh scar of the mass grave, and they understood that they were not negotiating from strength. The treaty was signed, and the Dominion withdrew from human space, and they never returned to New Haven, and the colony was left in peace to rebuild and grow. 1 year after the battle, the memorial was completed, and Hannah had designed it herself, and it stood at the edge of the valley, overlooking the mass grave where the invaders rested. It was a simple stone wall carved with 847 names, and at the base was an inscription that Taesan had written himself. The inscription read, "They came to take our home, and this is where they stayed." Survivors gathered for the dedication ceremony, and they stood together in the place where they had fought and bled and died, and they remembered those who were gone. Taesan spoke to them one last time as their wartime governor, and he said that they had shown the galaxy what humanity truly was, and they were not conquerors, and they were not saints, and they were survivors. He said that other species might be stronger or faster or more advanced, but none of them had the human gift for refusing to die, and none of them understood that sometimes the only way forward was through. He said that the stars were watching now, and they would remember New Haven, and every world that heard their story would think twice before threatening humanity again. When he finished speaking, the crowd was silent, and then someone began to sing, and others joined in, and the song rose up into the sky and filled the valley with sound. It was an old Earth song about home and hope and standing together, and it seemed fitting for this moment when they honored their dead and celebrated their survival. Yuna watched from the back of the crowd, and she thought about the messages still coming in. from across the galaxy, and she knew that everything had changed. Humanity had announced itself to the universe, and the announcement was written in blood and fire and defiance, and it said simply that we are here, and we will not be moved. The sun set over New Haven, and the memorial cast long shadows across the valley, and the stars came out one by one, and somewhere out in the darkness, other worlds were watching. They were watching and waiting and wondering what these strange creatures called humans would do next, and humanity smiled and got back to work, because there was always more work to do, and more challenges to face, and more enemies to defeat. And that was simply what humans did. They survived, they endured, they won.